Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. I'm very happy to welcome our guest for today, someone whose work I have admired for many years, Mr. John Opsopaus. He is a respected scholar and author who has been publishing his excellent works through many platforms for several decades. He has presented workshops on Hellenic magic, neo-paganism, Pythagorean theurgy, and spiritual practices. And as a retired university professor, he has more than 45 years of experience reading ancient Greek and Latin. He is the author of the excellent book, Oracles of Apollo, Practical Ancient Greek Divination for Today, which we will be discussing in today's interview, as well as the very newly published The Secret Texts of Hellenic Polytheism, which I'm sure we will kind of touch on a little bit today, and that hopefully we will have another discussion to talk about in more depth later. So I'm very happy to have you here and honored to talk with you today. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm honored to be on your podcast too. I'm very happy to do it.
Wonderful. So I want to get started first just by asking you, for people who may not know about your background, just kind of where did your interest in these Greek matters come from, and what was your path into paganism and Hellenic work in general?
Yeah, so that I think about this because people ask me about it from time to time. You know, it's sometimes hard to remember exactly how you got to where you are. But you know, when I was a little kid, I was interested in esoteric kinds of stuff, esoteric philosophy, magical practices. I remember I made a little grimoire when I was out of birch bark and stuff like that. When I don't know, I was probably middle school age, and so I loved Greek mythology, as so many people do. One of the in fact, the first book I bought from the bookmobile that used to come around school was a small collection of Greek mythology. So I had that kind of interest in Greek mythology, and later in Greek philosophy. So as I became more interested in philosophy, I really found that many of the ancient Greeks spoke to me, and Greek culture. You know, the dramatists and the poets, all and the historians all spoke to me. So by the time I was in college, I started teaching myself ancient Greek, starting with Homeric Greek. And later, I would say in the mid 1980s, well, really when I was in college, I had still, you know, kind of said to myself, you know, I feel more at home with these ancient Greeks in many respects than I do with many contemporary people. And so around the mid 1980s, I kind of realized, gee, I'm a pagan, you know, and as so many people have the experience of realizing, well, I've been a pagan all along, but now I have a word for it. And so naturally, the gods and the pantheon I gravitated towards was the Hellenic pantheon. And so as I started looking around at the pagan movement at that time, I realized that the Greek tradition was sort of a minority religion within a minority religion, and there weren't that many people around doing things with a Greek orientation, and so I decided, well, I really want to. That was where I really felt at home, and I wanted to try and figure out how to practice this religion. So one thing that I realized was that for the ancient Greek religions, we know a lot more, you know, because it was a literate culture and it's been studied to death for a couple thousand years. And so there's just a lot. We don't have to guess so much as with Celtic traditions or Norse traditions and things like that. So I started studying ancient Greek culture more as a practitioner. What can we learn about ancient practices? Not to do everything just like our ancestors did them, but to at least understand the way they did things and these practices that were used for thousands of years in many cases, and then to adapt them to the modern world. So that's something I started doing in the 1980s. And because we were relatively sparse in the neo-pagan community, I set up a networking organization called the Omphalos, which was for Greco-Roman pagans, broadly defined. And it operated through, snail mail, that people would send in their address, and I would send out announcements about where there were gatherings or whether there were festivals being organized. And so people could get in touch with each other and form groups or get together for rituals and things like that. And in the 1990s, I moved that onto the internet and basically continued it there for a number of years. So so my basic approach was, to basically try and look at the scholarship and see what we knew about ancient Greek religious practices and Roman religious practices as well, and magical practices and divinatory practices, and all of those things, and to try and figure out what was known. Of course, there are gaps, and so in some cases you have to fill stuff in. And what I've tried to do is either, in some cases intuition, in other cases looking at parallels from other religious traditions, especially where we've still got essentially living pagan traditions, in other parts of the world. And because a lot of the structure underneath is very similar. And so you can, if you understand what's going on, you can kind of make educated guesses to fill in my case, the Greek practices. And I put that stuff out on the web to share with other people, and that's really the basis for most of my writing, has been what I've discovered largely for my own practice. How can I then make it available to other people too, for their practice as well? And what I've tried to do is make it very clear when what I'm telling or suggesting is based on evidence, scholarly evidence, and when it's conjecture. So if you read something, and it's something that I made up, and it doesn't feel right to you, can say, okay, you got it wrong. I'm going to do it this other way, and that's fine. But I think it's important to try and help people understand what we've got some evidence for, and what is we're basically making up to try and fill in the gaps. So that's, I don't know, in brief, that's or maybe not so brief. That's the story.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, and it is true. I mean, in my own private practice, I work a lot with the Greek gods, with a kind of a Hellenic tenor to the work that I do, and that's been since I was a child. And in my own coven, we work with a variety of pantheons, but one of the main ones is the Greeks. But we also work with the Celts and the Norse, and it is very interesting that the ability to look at the breadth and the depth of scholarship, the amount that is in writing that we don't have in other cultures, which doesn't necessarily mean that everything is sideways compatible in that way, because of course they're different cultures and oftentimes very, very different timelines. But at the same time, it is beautiful. And I'm so glad that, authors like yourself have brought forward so much of that for the pagan community, so that we can explore that, at whether we're called to the Greek gods or not. I think there is so much that practitioners can learn from examining those texts and those ways of being.
Yeah,
so that's beautiful.
I agree. Yeah.
So looking at from the divination perspective, so you were saying how you were, of course, looking at Hellenic practice and looking at the texts, and then you were beginning to look at forms of divination that, of course, divination for the Greeks was really crucial thing, which I have some questions on that I want to touch on. But what was what first got you interested in bringing back forms of Greek divination, or how did that come up? Is it something that you found out about and were doing research on, and you fell down a rabbit hole of needing to do, that work, or did someone else suggest it to you? What kind of was that story?
Well, so that was another gradual process. I'd used a number of divination systems. I used rune casting. I used a tarot. I've used I Ching. Works very well for me, and what have you, other sorts of systems from time to time. And so this was also back in the 1990s. I was in an online group where we were, it was a tarot group. And somebody suggested a group project. They said, well, let's just go through the whole deck. And every once a week, we'll publish our own interpretations of a card. And so I was very interested in Pythagorean numerology and Pythagorean philosophy more generally. And so I thought, well, this is a natural. We started with the minors. I thought, well, there's a natural for a Pythagorean interpretation, so I'll do that. So we went through the minors. I think we went through them suit by suit, as I recall. But anyway, and we went through the minors in order. And so, once a week, I'd type up a little essay on sort of a Pythagorean interpretation of one of the cards. And then we went through the majors after that. Well, interestingly enough, or maybe not surprisingly, almost everyone dropped out of this project, and only two of us got all the way through it, and not on schedule either, I might add. But when as part of this, I said, well, the images in any of the traditional tarots, again, didn't really speak to me from a Greek perspective. And of course, by that time, there were pagan tarots of one sort or another already available, and I like them and I've used them quite a bit. But I started designing my own images also to go with it, essentially pre-Christian images, primarily based in Greek mythology. And so I designed this tarot that came to be known as the Pythagorean tarot, and put it out on the web. It's still out there. And as is a practice in the Golden Dawn and in similar sorts of organizations, at a certain stage, you make your own tarot deck. You're working from standard models, but it's a spiritual practice to actually make your own deck. And so I did that, and I made a deck for myself with my own quite limited artistic ability. So people kept writing me and saying, well, where can I get this deck? And so finally, I had it published. And so the book, which is a fairly substantial book, and the deck was published in 2001. So that was sort of my first foray into a divination system that I felt was more consistent with the ancient Greek pagan tradition. But, obviously, Pythagoras didn't have a tarot deck. It was sort of a recreation. What might Pythagoras or Pythagoreans have done if they had wanted to make a tarot deck? That sort of thing. But in any case, that then got me interested in, well, obviously they didn't have a tarot deck, but what did they have? How were they doing divination? And I knew about, divination with birds and clouds and incense smoke and a lot of other things like that, but I wasn't sure what types of techniques they used. And so this is where there's an old book I cited in the Oracles, and I'm trying to remember now when it was published. It was early 20th century, if I remember right, Halliday's Greek Divination. And I got a hold of that book, and it was very informative because it talked about the actual systems that were used, but it didn't present them in a usable form. As so often when scholars study these things, they'll say, well, there's a whole bunch of Oracle verses, and here's an example of 5 of them, and so it's like, well, okay, that's, that's great, but, I can't use it. But as good scholars do, he gave sources. And so, there's these huge books that collect copies of the inscriptions that have been copied off of, every piece of rock around the Mediterranean and published. And so I started, fortunately, I had access to a good library. So I started digging through those, and also some other books that have been written about, in German, as it turns out, about ancient Greek divination. And that's where I encountered the alphabet oracle. And I thought, well, this is fantastic. It's like a system of rune casting, but we've got the key. We've got the meaning of the 24 letters, whereas we've got some very nice systems of rune casting, but mostly they're made up by people. Ralph Bloom basically says, well, I just kind of came up with the meanings that felt good. And so we don't have much in terms of documentation. And again, I don't in any sense deny that you can come up with a good divination system that way. But again, I like to start, if we know something, I like to start from what we know. And then if if you don't like it, you can change it. So there was this tablet that had been transcribed in Asia Minor, which had this alphabet oracle on it. And so there wasn't any English translation of it. So I did my own translation based on this transcribed text, and I put it out on the web and started using it myself. And, I got regular feedback from people, saying how well it had worked for them. And, I was at, conferences like PantheaCon, where I was just a member of the audience or something, and somebody would stand up and say, oh, well, there's this great divination system I've been using. It's the Greek alphabet oracle. And so that's what motivated me to then publish the book about it too. Because in the meantime, since I did that first translation of that one tablet, there have been scholarly studies collecting all of the tablets that contain the alphabet oracle. And like any of these ancient texts, there's variant readings. Sometimes it's hard to read what the actual stone says because it's broken, chipped away, it's worn away. Other times there are actual different texts. They're all very similar, but sometimes, one will have one verse and another in that same position will have a different verse, either with the same meaning or sometimes with a completely different meaning. So I forget exactly when that was published, but I think it was actually in the 2000s. Yeah, in the 2000s, maybe 2007 or something. This, again, German book by Johannes Dalé was published, which collected all of the texts of the alphabet oracle and also some of the other dice oracles, which I've also been using and had done some translation on that. And so that then gave me an opportunity to essentially do new translations and to use the best texts that was available for the oracles to do this. And so that's what I did in the book with, as you know, also the Oracle of the Seven Sages and just a lot of background information. But I try to present the oracles because each one of these oracles, there's just for each letter of the Greek alphabet, there's just one line, one hexameter line, so a relatively short line. And so they're quite ambiguous, in many cases. And so what I tried to do was present them, and I'd even done this back when I did the web page that had the translation, is to try and, for each of the Greek words, to present alternative meanings for that word. Because just like English words, each Greek word has a whole array of meanings, and you can only present one of them in the translation. You can try and pick an English word that has a similar constellation of meanings, but it's a different language, so they don't. And so by presenting alternative meanings, you can kind of look and see how an ancient Greek might have read this and interpreted it, and help you to that way solve the oracle. Because this is, again, an important thing about oracles, is they have to be solved like riddles. And that's part of the ancient divination process. But having a better idea of what the ancient Greek words means, I think helps you to do that. So, again, there's much more documentation because, again, the Greeks tended to write things down. And they also wrote things down on stone. So it's survived relatively well. And so there's a number of ancient Greek divination systems that survive. There's the alphabet oracle, and there's several different dice or knucklebone oracles that also survive. And they work quite well, I find, even though they were, in a sense, considered a lower kind of divination as opposed to, say, the Delphic oracle or something like that.
And I think that speaks to that you spend some time in the book at the beginning really setting up not just placing it historically, because I mean the history of it is important to know, and of course I find that fascinating, but it's also a mindset thing of where you speak about like the mindset of what we know, and this is something where some of course is going to be conjecture and how we read it in the modern day, but there are enough treatises and things written by philosophers about how they viewed how divination works. I mean, there's Cicero's on divination. There's lots of different actual source material they have of people discussing why divination works or if it does and how that works, which is fascinating and is more than just the lines on the stones, as you're mentioning. And that's important to have at the beginning of the book so people can kind of get into that mindset. And I think that's also very beautiful in the book because that can help inform just what our thoughts as practitioners are on the practice of divination. But can you talk a little bit about the mindset of ancient Greeks and why divination was so important? And there's two different types of divination, or kind of roughly like that. There's the inspired forms of divination, like prophecy. And then, of course, there's like technical things, like you were saying, knucklebones or these alphabet oracles. And maybe can you just expand for us a little bit on the mindset and why it was important?
Sure. And it comes, of course, divination is a Latin word or a Latin derived word, but it's got the word divine right in it there. And that's really the key to it, is that all the ancient people really saw divination as a way of getting in contact with the gods, of communing with the gods, having them speak to you. And, this was a religion where people expected some sort of regular contact with the gods. And so that's why divination was a part of almost every kind of religious practice. And of course, the Delphic oracle is the most famous, because anyone who could afford to, went there to try and get advice on important matters of state, often, founding of new colonies, things like that. But there are other oracles too around, many oracles around the Mediterranean, where people could go to try and get advice. But they were getting advice from the gods. That was the thing. So it wouldn't. I don't think it would be accurate to call it fortune telling, in the sense that they weren't necessarily trying to get a prediction of the future. Often they were trying to get advice, and it might be advice about health, for example. If it was a political thing, it might be advice about whether to found a colony or to start a war, or how a war was going to come out, something like that, or what to do about it. And but it was because of that connection with the divine that this was your way of interacting with the gods, and this idea that only Apollo was privileged to know the mind of Zeus, and so Apollo is sort of the principal god of divination in Greece. So, in any sort of religious activity, whether it was a sacrifice or any sort of offering, would usually have some divination to make sure the gods were favorable to it, that it was a good time, for example. Any sort of founding would be divination to make sure that it should be done and that this was a good time to do it. So really anything where you wanted the concurrence of the gods or the support of the gods, or at least not the opposition of the gods, it was important to do some kind of divination. And since the gods are involved in all aspects of everyday life, you know, you would do divination for all of these things. But it was always contact with the gods is the key thing about it. And so it's that contact with the divine. So in that sense, if theurgy, is a kind of practice for getting in contact with the gods, divination is just one form of theurgy. It's not necessarily invoking the gods, but it's contacting them through some other medium, whether it's a dream or whether it's inspired prophecy, like with the Delphic oracle, or whether it's using some instruments like the alphabet oracle or dice or something else like that, or many other things. Scrying in a sacred pool or in a bowl of water, scrying in an altar fire. So many sort of less defined or structured types of divination as well. Again, observing the birds was a very common system in both Greece and Rome, and further out in the Mid-East too. So that's, I think, maybe a little bit about the mindset is that, it's a religious practice. It's fundamentally a religious practice. And it's to sort of open a line of communication between the individual and the deities.
Yeah, and I like how you make the point in the book, which I think is important, that it's kind of, as you just said, it's a relationship, and therefore it's not necessarily just focused on the future. It was oftentimes understanding, for example, like why something had happened the way that it had in your city-state, or why this was happening in your life, so that you could better understand and get the advice of the gods on it. So it is future related, but it's also kind of understanding the past and the present, which is common in many systems of divination. It's not like this is unique, but there was a tradition around you're understanding the situation better and then getting advice on it, as opposed to purely asking about like what's going to happen next week, although that's probably going to be a part of it if you need some practical advice.
Right, that's right. So, and of course, that could be a reason for doing multiple divinations, So like a typical sort of thing might be, why are we having a plague in the city? And you do a divination and say, oh, well, it's because, this temple was defiled, or, somebody offended a god in this way, or whatever it might be, and then you can do a follow-up divination. Okay, what can we do about it? And, you have to build a new temple or make a sacrifice or do whatever. And so, yes, past, present, and future are all the sorts of things you might suppose the gods know something about, and can help you on, but that's all part of it. So in that sense, it's to make an analogy, it's probably, divination is probably as essential to ancient pagan religions as, say, the communion is to Christian religion. It's sort of a central ritual act that's part of almost any religious, and because religion permeated society, all the sort of just mundane activities as well.
Yeah. And there's you point out the idea that, again, because we have these writings from people about their thoughts on it, there was discussion of like why, for example, the Delphic oracle was famous for kind of having enigmatic statements as her replies, and even like you said, the phrases for these various letter oracles are only single statements, some of which are very clear, like things are going to go well, essentially, but some of them are more enigmatic than that, and so interpretation is an important part of that. Can you talk about like how that mindset plays into interpreting? Why is it necessary for it to be a little bit unclear? Wouldn't it be easy? Yeah. Basically,
well, and I think the answer is that they weren't sure. This was a question that was debated by the philosophers and by other just common people too. Is why does this have to be so confusing? And they came up with different explanations. I mean, part of the answer might be the communication channel is just not that high bandwidth, you might say. and that's the way they come through. And this comes back to let me make a slight digression here, that in terms of understanding divination theoretically, by the Neoplatonists, for example, they said that when we interact with the gods, they're interacting not with our physical body, but with our ethereal body. And that our ethereal body was also where our imagination was located. So essentially, the effect they were having was not on our ears, not on our eyes, but it was on our ethereal body, which was sort of going directly to our imagination. This is why imagination is so important in many of these practices. But our senses also go through our imagination. But so does a lot of other stuff. Our imagination is not, in that sense, sort of a clear channel through which everything just flows straightforwardly. And our imagination tends to communicate in images. So it's partly just because of the nature of human beings and the nature of divine beings that this communication is going to be somewhat muddled up. The other answer is that, well, yeah, but that's kind of the way it ought to be too, that the gods want us to think for ourselves and devote some thought and contemplation and insight into what they say to interpret it in the best possible way. So in sort of the esoteric traditions of ancient Greece, an enigma, which is where we get the word enigma, was a saying, it was a riddle really, but it was a riddle with some sort of spiritual import to it, that solving the riddle or contemplating the riddle was the spiritual practice. So it's like a Zen koan is the clearest analogy, and I think that's very it's a very close analogy. And so there's lots of these enigmata around. The philosopher Heraclitus is kind of filled with them, but many of the other ancient spiritual teachers were as well. But the oracles were too. So you see, that was the idea, that the point is not to give you an answer. The point is to get you to think in a certain way, to contemplate in a certain way, to transform your thinking, really. And then when your thinking is transformed, you'll be able to get the answer you need. Not necessarily the right answer, the answer you need.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is, so that's one explanation, which I think makes a lot of sense. That it's in a sense appropriate that these oracles are superficially confusing or superficially misleading. You will destroy a great empire, right?
Yeah.
You should consider the thought that it might be yours the oracle's talking about.
Specifics are tricky.
Yes, that's right. And I think it's also, there was this notion that the first person to get a clear interpretation of an oracle, that was probably the right one. Again, they're probably guided by the gods. You're kind of thinking that the gods are giving them some guidance towards the right meaning. Mm-hmm. But it's important to try and grasp the right meaning in that way. Now, other people said, because oracles were kind of used as esoteric lore, that it was to hide secret knowledge from people that, were not sophisticated enough to be able to interpret the oracles correctly, allegorically, for example, and things like that.
Lots of different ways to look at why.
Yeah, it's similar in a way that, it's the point is the way, what it does to your mind is kind of the point of the oracle. It's to change your mind, but not necessarily in a direct way of like, oh, I believe that, now I believe something different, but to get you thinking about things in a different way. And this is one reason I think divination is so valuable. You turn up a tarot card and, well, you can look in the book and see what it supposedly means, but that isn't where you get much out of it. You get much more out of it by contemplating the card, and the image and its relation to the other cards and so forth. And that's where your real insights come from. And I think it's the same with these oracles too.
I
It's a
think
spiritual practice.
absolutely. And I think that ties a little bit into, I want to get into the way in which you work with, I mean, like, as you mentioned, there's two different oracle systems that you have in the book. There are there's the alphabet oracle, and that's the kind of one I want to go to first. But in terms of just like practically how you work with it, because then I have some questions about acceptance of the oracle and things like that after the fact. But can you explain to someone, if you were going to give a reading via this, you've already compared this as an alphabet oracle, it's similar to runes, which is something people may be very familiar with at this point. But if somebody came to you with a question, or if you had a question, how do you generally, or what is a simple method to cast and get an answer from the oracle?
So what I would do is do a little ritual. And again, the main point of the ritual is to kind of center yourself, focus your mind on whatever the question is. Alphabet oracle tends to be more concrete questions, not so much seeking spiritual advice as, again, asking how something's going to come out or what you should do or something like that. And so with a little ritual to try and to sort of center yourself, focus yourself, contemplate on the question, then you draw a letter of the Greek alphabet, one of the 24 letters of the Greek alphabet. The simplest way is to have a bunch of alphabet stones with each of the letter on it. And I keep them in a bag, and I tend to rummage around in the bag and until one of them sort of comes to me. You know, it either feels a little different or it just seems to kind of want to be in my hand, and that's the one I draw out. So then you get a letter of the Greek alphabet. So then each of those letters has this one line that goes with it. And so typically what you would do, unless you've been using it for a while, so you've kind of internalized it, is you would look that letter up in the book. And what I give you is a sort of a verse translation, which begins with a Roman letter, which is kind of similar. So, you know, I'll just use beta, for example. So you pull a beta, and so you look in the book and it says, briefly wait, the time's not right for thee. Okay. Begins with a B, which is like beta. Well, okay, you know, but then you go and I give you a more literal translation, not too different in that case. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. And then I give you maybe some expanding the range of meanings of all of those words. Now, again, that's actually a pretty straightforward one, but you know, wait, there might be some other meanings for the word wait. Yeah, and then I give you some possible interpretations that you might take from that. But again, you have to apply that to your question, you know. So what is it? Maybe you didn't ask about whether you should do something right now, and it says briefly wait. Well, okay. The oracle tells you what the god thinks you ought to know, which may not be what you asked, you know. So whatever you asked, the god is saying, wait, it's not a good time. That could just be, it's not a good time to ask, you know. But it could also be that whatever it is you are asking about should at least be delayed. So, you know, what I would do then is I would look at the oracle, think about, especially if it doesn't seem like it fits the question very well, I would look at some of the alternative meanings. And, you know, one way to think about this is you're having essentially an audience with a god, except the god's behind a screen, you know. So if you went to the temple and you, you know, paid your money or whatever, and you asked your question, and the voice of the god came out from behind the screen and said, briefly wait, the time's not right for you. Next. You know, that was it. You got it. You got your answer. Now you've got to go away and think, what was that God trying to tell me, and how does that apply to me? Not necessarily how does it answer my question, it may not, but how does it apply to me? It's some kind of advice that the God thought I needed. And so if you think about it as, you can think of some sort of, um, um, stereotypical Eastern guru that, just comes out with this one line statement. And it's like, okay, that's it. That's all you get. Now you've got to try and think about it. Now you can, of course, do follow-up readings. But again, if you have sort of an attitude of respect, you're dialoguing with the deity in this kind of indirect way. You're kind of not going to pester them, you're going to think very carefully about do I need a follow-up question? What is the follow-up question? Don't just ask again, but asks for some clarification, for example. Again, very much like you do with tarot, I think, you get a reading, it's confusing, you can't quite figure it out. You may do another reading to elaborate on different parts of the spread or something like that. So that's kind of I don't know, it's a relatively simple mindset. And I think, how was this used in the ancient world? Most of these alphabet oracles seem to have been set up in public spaces, like the town square. And from some similar oracles, we know that there might be a column there with the stuff engraved on it. There would be some oil lamps standing around it. There'd probably be a statue of some deity, maybe Apollo or Hermes. And somebody would come by. They would maybe make some money donation. They'd put some oil in the oil lamps. They'd light the oil lamps. They would pray to the god for a divination, and then they would somehow, we're not sure how, cast the oracle, maybe drawing stones, and then get their answer, and they'd go on their way. So these would be people. They could be people that lived there. They could be people passing through. They seem to have been in centers where there was a lot of people passing through. So I think, it could have been people traveling for business or on religious pilgrimages or for whatever reason. They wanted some insight about what they should do next. In that case, briefly wait, the time's not right for thee, is very reasonable. Don't go on to your next stop. Stay a few days in this town or whatever it is. That's the advice,
Yeah. And that kind of speaks to there are in that worldview, there were oracles that you'd go to that would be a huge pilgrimage if you could even afford to be able to make it to those sites and to be heard. Then those could be, huge endeavors for a person in their life. And then there are also ones that are very useful that would be in a town square. And in a sense, like both are in communion with the divine. They're both words from the gods that you're getting. They're just very, very different ways of going about it, but it's very similar in terms of what you're doing. Just one involves the extra step of religious pilgrimage and sacrifice and all of that.
Right. And like many things, the more you invest in it, often the more you get out of it. So it's probably the same here too. I think, somebody that just, draws the stone and just figures that's enough, they're probably not going to get a very good answer. Somebody that does a bit of a ritual, makes an offering, like lighting the oil lamps, filling and lighting the oil lamps and stuff like that, prays to the god, they're probably going to get a better answer. But we know there were lots of inexpensive, relatively low cost ways of getting oracles. A lot of the temples, when they're excavated, there's thousands of dice and knuckle bones in them. We presume they were used for divination. We don't think everyone was in there playing dice, that they were used for divination. And it was probably, again, if it was a relatively inexpensive way to get an oracle. The oracle at Dodona, again, you could have the priestesses listening to the whispering of the leaves of the oak trees, or you could have a lower cost way of divination where you would take a lead sheet, write your question on it, roll it up, put your initials on the outside, give it to the priestess, and she would answer your question, and without reading and announce, for Jo, your answer is such and such, and then again, you would have to go off and, figure out how that answer applied to you if it wasn't an obvious answer to your question.
There were a lot of different options because, as you said, like it was much more of a, and I think that's kind of difficult, maybe less so amongst the people who are listening to this podcast, but it's a difficult thing for some of us as modern people to kind of get into the mindset of like how integrated all of this was. And I think that's something that we get also from studying the source materials for the Greeks and the Romans, because we do get to see a little bit more inside the mindset and how involved it was in all aspects, which is very interesting and helpful, I think. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about before we go on is, so when you mentioned in the book that once you've done a reading, there's the aspect of, how do you put it? Basically accepting the oracle, where you then create a talisman or do something to accept what it is that you've been told. And this kind of gets into the discussion of like what is fated versus, what are you accepting when you do that? And I was wondering if you could just tell us briefly, when you have drawn that stone, and let's say it's briefly, wait, the time's not right for thee, or one of those, you think about it and figure out how it relates to your question. And then there's another step, right? Unlike with some people, I think it's more like you do a tarot spread, you understand what the cards are trying to tell you, you write it down. Hopefully you're keeping good records. And that is kind of usually where people leave it, unless you're going to do magic around that or some other ritual practice. So for this, how is that kind of different?
Well, I can be quite the same, actually. So you get your answer, and as you say, you keep a record of it. It's a smart thing to do. And of your question and the answer and your interpretation of it. So it is important. Now, you don't have to do it right away, I think, but it's important to, after you've thought about it for a while, to decide, okay, this is what this is telling me, okay, and then to write that down. And essentially, now I don't know that it must work this way, but I think of that as kind of gelling that future, not in the sense of determining it, but it's kind of like there are other possible interpretations of that oracle, and you can sort of think of it in quantum terms. There's all of these different possible futures, and you're kind of picking one of them. Now, that doesn't mean you can just make up the meaning you want. I think it has to be consistent with what the oracle says. Otherwise, like with you'll destroy a great empire, you're just fooling yourself. So, the idea is to consult your intuition, which again is the way the gods often speak to us, and try and come up with a plausible, likely significance. Let me say significance rather than meaning. What is its significance for you in terms of what you should do? And then, of course, write that down as well. Then obviously you want to see how things turn out. Okay, if you realize down the road you totally misread it, well, that's too bad. But at least you've learned something. Again, I would say it's conceivable, certainly, that the gods wanted you to misread it. That however it turned out is something that the gods wanted you to experience. So there's, you can have a sense of free will, and also the gods can also certainly influence our lives as well. And so those are not incompatible. And it's difficult to figure out exactly how they relate. I don't know a simple answer to that.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, it strikes me as coming into the same discussion of like when people get answers that they don't particularly like, and then you get, a card, you draw a card that is more challenging than you want, or, it's just not what you're looking for, or it's something that is not going to be the happiest situation that you were hoping for when you went to the divination system. And I think then I was talking to somebody about that and about the acceptance of it. And they were saying, well, what if I don't want to? What if I just say, I don't accept this? I don't want to write it down because I don't want it to be. Is that kind of dipping into the, what can you do to sort of go against the gods without saying, I'm challenging in a way that is improper, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't think that would be particularly effective. And again, if you kind of imagine that you had just, gone to the top of the mountain to meet the great guru, and they gave you an unpleasant answer, and you just said, well, I'm too bad, I didn't like that answer, I'm going to ignore it. Well, you went to all that trouble to find something out, or to get some advice, and you're now choosing to ignore it. So I don't know that the gods necessarily would be vengeful about that.
But it's just not the smartest,
It's just not the smartest thing to do. Yeah. And so
yeah, and that's also kind of then that's not in keeping with the Zen koan type of, you need to think through it more rather than just saying, well, I don't like it, I'm done. That's clearly not doing the work to change your own thinking and kind of better understand what's going on.
Yeah, again, to take the example I picked out of briefly wait, that time's not right for thee. You could look at your watch and say, okay, I waited 10 minutes. I'm now going to go ahead and do it anyway. Sort of a literalist meaning, it's like, okay, I did what you said. Now I'm free and clear. No, you didn't get the point, and that's the real thing, is to try and feel like you got the point. And again, that there's no guarantee you're going to be correct. And there's no guarantee that your interpretation is going to be what holds in the future either. But I think what I'm trying to say there also is, don't just kind of waffle around saying, well, it could be this, could be that, this is good, that's bad, I'm just going to let it go, and see how things turn out, and maybe decide after the fact what it all meant. Well, again, it's kind of a waste of that divination. And I think, if you think, this is why there's some value in having some high cost to divination, having some ritual and so forth, because again, what you put in tends to be what you get out. And if it's just like, oh, well, let's just pull a stone and see what it says, well, you're going to get the same sort of random answer, as if you just picked a random sentence out of a book or something. So it's all part of the investment, part of our spiritual investment in the process that tends to get us a good response, and then also give us a good understanding of the response as well. And, and hopefully, as part of understanding the response, we also get some insights as to what we should do about it. If there's something particularly we should do, even if it's just to do nothing for a period of time. Now, what I suggest, and we don't have much evidence that this was done in the ancient world, but what I suggest is you can essentially transfer the alphabet oracle into alphabet magic. We do know that the Greek alphabet was used in many magical procedures. So essentially what you can do is make a talisman incorporating that letter of the Greek alphabet and your interpretation of it to try and reinforce that. Again, you're investing in it a certain amount of spiritual energy, building in some other symbology, and you can do that really with whatever sort of magical practice you might have. But in this case, also incorporating that letter of the Greek alphabet, and maybe depending on what kind of thing you're doing, the actual text of the oracle as well. So it reinforces whatever you've decided to do about the oracle. or to
Absolutely.
not do.
That can
It's
fit, yeah, that can fit into whatever your system is that you practice more regularly.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Related to that, you have in for each of the letters, you have also, in addition to kind of explaining it and in some cases going over what some of the Greek words mean, what a more literal translation would be to kind of help you understand what the mindset might be of that word. You also have some correspondences, like zodiacal correspondences, like hieroglyphs for some of them. They're very interesting. Perhaps you mentioned it somewhere in the book, but where did things like the hieroglyph for it and things like that? You mentioned where some of those correspondences come from, but can you just explain a little bit of those and what you might use those for? Because it is very.
So the hieroglyphs come from a standard system that was developed, I believe, in Ptolemaic Egypt, for transcribing Greek words into hieroglyphs. And it's sometimes called a hieroglyphic alphabet, but it's 20 some odd of the hieroglyphs that were used to basically represent sounds in the Greek alphabet, or sounds of the Greek language, I should say. And the most famous example of this is on the Rosetta Stone, which is how it was cracked, is that the names of different public figures, Cleopatra was one of them, were written both in Greek letters and in the so-called hieroglyphic alphabet. So, it's an approximate correspondence, but we do have this alphabet with one hieroglyph for each letter, basically. Well, that you can use, because those hieroglyphs are, I would say, symbolically potent. They're pictorial. They kind of connect with these Greco-Egyptian magical traditions. So especially if you're doing something like making a talisman, you can use them. I don't think I included it in the book, but I give an example of a talisman sometimes when I give talks for one of these oracles. And what I did on that is there's the Greek letter, there's the oracle itself, and I write it in Greek, so it's inscribed in Greek. And on the other side, there's a daimon, or a spirit, for each letter of the Greek alphabet. And that comes from one of the Greek magical papyri. And so, because we're talking Greco-Egyptian magic, I write the name of that spirit in that hieroglyphic alphabet. And on the other side, so I've got maybe a dozen hieroglyphs there, and then that spirit can also be invoked as a way of charging that talisman, so that would be one typical use of the hieroglyphs. And again, they come from this sort of alphabetical use of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And there's some speculation of that's a distant ancestor, actually, of the Greek alphabet via the Phoenician and Semitic alphabets. The other correspondences, they're fairly traditional. Some of them go back to late antiquity. Others only go back to the Renaissance. And for those, I say, there's some very neat correspondences between the alphabet and the zodiacal signs and the planets and the elements. Try them out. Even if we find something in one of the Greek magical papyri, that doesn't mean it works. So I think all of these things, just because it's old doesn't mean it's better. And so on all of these correspondences, especially, I think we have to look at them, see if they speak to us, and then also try them out. Because just because it's old doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we start with that, I think, because we would be foolish to just ignore what people were thinking back then, when this was much more of a living tradition. but we can't stop there either. And so I think we always have to look at these things critically. That would apply to the alphabet oracle as well, for that matter, or any of these things. Just because it was carved doesn't mean it was true or that it worked.
I think that kind of gets to talking a little bit about as you've mentioned, and we've talked a little bit about in each of the descriptions for these letters, you give sometimes descriptions of the importance of various words and kind of understanding how that would have been viewed. And I think that's really interesting because it does come up with other forms of divination where we're attempting to understand a little bit of a mindset that is essentially foreign from our own. So we have this need to sort of try to get outside of our own way of looking at things in order to better understand the system we're using. But that's very limited because we can only do so much with that because, we are who we are and we come from the culture we come from. But still, it's important to try to get outside of them, try to understand those concepts. And that's very good for the Greeks because we can interpret some of these words a little bit easier. And one of the words that comes up very frequently, and I find myself talking about it a lot when I'm talking to my coven mates about especially things that involve the Greek gods, is the idea of time, like proper timing. Kairos, I believe, is the word, and how important that was for them. And that's a word that comes up a lot. And I was wondering if you could just tell people a little bit about that, because I think that's we've already talked about it. Because briefly, wait, the time not right. That's an example right there.
Exactly. And so this was, the Greeks had a number of words for time, but this word kairos is especially important. And it's translated as time, opportune time, sometimes just opportunity. So it's the idea, timing is everything is really what it's about. Is that there are inflection points in time where things can change a lot, and when it's crucial to do things, and that's the kairos. And so perceiving the kairos is a very important part of it, and that applies to divination too. I talked about rummaging around in the bag of alphabet stones. Well, that's a matter of kairos. When is the instant that I picked the stone? Okay, and so I have to have a sense of when that proper time is. And there's a view. I think this actually comes from Carl Jung originally, talking about the I Ching. That essentially what you're doing in an act of divination is you're doing an action that kind of takes a snapshot of the entire universe at that time. And then you're using that sort of holistic understanding of everything to get your reading. And so it's kind of important when you do that. And it's not something you can calculate typically. It's something that you have to have that feeling for. And to my mind, that's part of a good user of any divination system, is having it. When do you cut the tarot deck? That cut should be at the kairos, the proper time. Or when do you roll a dice? That sort of instantaneous action, that's what slices time at that point. And if that's the kairos, then you get a good reading. Okay, so it's important to have the feeling for the kairos. Another example, I think I got this from Peter Kingsley when he was talking about kairos, is that if you think about sailing a boat, when you tack, you have to do it at the right time if you're tacking back and forth. And so again, it's not something you can really calculate. It's something you have to feel now. And so that deep sense of the appropriate time for something, or the most opportune time, is really what kairos is. And of course, that involves so much of our life, right? Whether it's deciding whether to brake when you're driving, or or whether it's deciding some major event in your life, it's really all about kairos. as the joke goes, it's all about the timing. Um,
Yeah. But that's also,
so
and that also gets into that not all timing is exactly the same, that there is a proper time, or there are better times for things than others, which I think is starting to be more talked about. At least I've heard more people talking about it in occult circles, and just in general a little bit more about how it's not all the same when you do something. Not just for astrology, of course, there's always been sort of like astrological timing for things, which is part of that, but that also there's that idea of the importance of proper timing is kind of coming back into discussions, which is why I find it really fascinating. Of course, the Greeks word for that and concern with that, which is helpful.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, like many things, if you have a word for it, then you can become more aware of it. So, if you don't have a word for that proper or opportune time, then you might not think so much about it. But
Yeah,
yeah, now you can always ask, well, what is the kairos for this that we're doing here? Or recognizing the kairos when it happens. You may not have been planning something, but now you realize this is an opportune moment to do whatever it may be, and or not do whatever it may be. And recognizing it when it comes to you is an important part of that.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in terms of your daily and your divination practice, how, I know it's very difficult to talk about like generalities, but about how does divination fit into your personal practice? What you can tell us, about how you sort of work with that in your life. Are there, I'm sure there, as you mentioned, like ritualizing the beginning of doing divination, I'm sure that's a part of it, but are there other ways that you tend to do daily divination, or it's less frequently, or around certain, festival dates or anything like that? Like, how does that, speaking of timing?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I talking in particular about the two oracles in the book, I use them somewhat differently. So I mean, I have to say a lot of the decisions I make in my life, I think them through like most people do, more or less well, and just do it. But for if I'm having trouble reaching a decision, um, or I feel like I'm not, I feel like I don't have all of the insight into it, then I would typically use the alphabet oracle. So this, it's certainly not every day, it's not even every week, but it's whenever I need it. And so, like I said, I tend to think that you get better results if you put more into it. So, like when I do the I Ching, I use the arrow stalks. You know, it's much slower and more tedious than the coins, but that puts you in a contemplative state of mind, and it kind of, in some sense, almost gets you a little bit out of time so you can see the time better. And so I have always found that to be much more effective for me. Um, Again, it's partly just because it changes my mental state. So the same thing with the alphabet oracle. Even though I could in 2 minutes, grab a stone, and have my reading. Um, I will tend to do a more elaborate divination ritual, maybe burn some incense, um, um, pray either using a prayer like that in the book or a different one, and again spend some time getting myself into a proper receptive state of mind, and then um, typically turn over, repeat the question multiple times in my head, so that's kind of my only focus, um, and then let it go for the actual drawing or casting of the oracle. Um, and again, I tend to do that in a relatively ritualistic way, even if the operation is physically relatively simple, like drawing a stone or casting some dice. Um, and I will stay in that ritual framework while I look at the oracle and sort of at least do an initial interpretation of the oracle. I'll try and do that all in the ritual space. So this is something that takes probably an hour, but certainly at least a half an hour. So it's not something you do whether you're deciding, what to have for breakfast or which restaurant to go to, which I think would be a silly thing to do a divination over anyway. But, again, would you go to the great guru on the top of the mountain to ask him what to have for breakfast? No, so I tend to do divination for relatively serious issues, and especially ones that I don't think I can figure out on my own, or at least I'm not so arrogant as to think I should try and figure it out on my own. Okay, maybe I know all of this, but I probably don't. So let's get some other advice, at least some other ways of thinking about it. And and so then I'll write the stuff out and and close down my ritual in the usual sort of way. So it is a magical sort of activity that, like I said, probably takes an hour, could take more. Now, so that's a fairly specific question. I mean, it could be a vague question, but it's a particular matter. Now, for many years, I haven't been doing it so much the past year, but for many years, I would draw one of the sayings of the seven sages a day, because that's more general sort of how to be a good person type of advice. And, you don't have to have a specific question, although you can have a specific question. You can also just basically be saying, what do I need to know today? Or what should I be thinking about? Or what should I be trying to do? And it's good advice. And it's been remarkable sometimes, although there's 147 of them. So, the chance of drawing the same one twice in a row is not too big. I've had the same stone come out 6 days in a row, saying, okay, still need to work on this.
Oh, yes. I know about when they can be insistent and you're like, oh, really? Still have to work on that. Okay, here we go.
Exactly. And that's when this stuff is working too.
Yeah.
But so I use them somewhat differently that way. And so that for a daily divination, probably the Oracle of the Seven Sages is a little bit better.
Yeah, no, I've been experimenting more with doing daily with that lately, and it is very effective and very, very helpful, I have to say, although my initial foray into your work was through the alphabet oracle interpretations in your book. So yeah, they're both very effective and useful and super helpful. So
yeah, good. Well, that's generally the feedback I've got from other people as well. And I think those two oracles in particular are somewhat complementary,
Are there other forms of divination outside of these that you practice either in your ritual work or just on the side? I mean, do you still work with tarot? I mean, the tarot deck that you created, of course, or with others? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I still do tarot. I use my own deck. I got probably hundreds of tarot decks. And like many people. I don't know that I can offhand name another. Well, the Mythic Tarot. Again, it's a Greek-oriented one, and I've got good results with that. I used to use that quite regularly.
I don't have that one, but I've heard many, many good things about that one. So yes. And I do recommend it. So in terms of, as we're kind of coming closer to the end, I always like to ask if there are pieces of advice that you may want to share with people about their divination practice or their spiritual practice. We have not yet spoken about the new book that you have coming out, which, like I said, I hope we will have you on to talk more specifically about that. But in that book, I believe, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I will be very soon. It has a lot of examples of, ritual tech and prayers and ways of practice. And I was wondering if there's anything in particular that you feel like people should focus more on in their practice, or more advice that you find yourself giving oftentimes to people.
Well, I guess what I would say is practice, do it. That there are many of these spiritual practices. I've tended to focus in the Greek tradition, and in particular on the Neoplatonic tradition because they're relatively well documented and they're philosophically sound. But you know, the most important part about spiritual practices is they change you gradually as you practice them. So I would say have some sort of practice, you know, something you do every day. And I mean, you know, having talked so much about the Greek, I mean, I mentioned I do I Ching sometimes. I still do that when I need an answer that seems like it goes with that, or a question that goes with that. I do Qigong, you know, because it works for me, you know. So have some regular spiritual practices. They can come out of any tradition, really. They don't have to be old, you know, but, you know, they should be working, you know. So try things out. And if they don't seem to be working, either change them or find something else to do. And that includes divination. You know, I think because divination is a way of putting us in contact with the gods, well, that's a good thing to do, you know. And so doing regular divination is itself a spiritual practice. And you know, almost every time the ancient Greeks, you know, had a glass of wine or a cup of wine, you know, or started an altar or started a fire or did almost anything else, they took it as an omen as well. You know, they looked for signs. So they were sort of continually doing divination as part of their daily lives. And I think that's good. That's a good practice. So, you know, whatever your tradition is or whatever practices you do, you know, make sure to do them. Don't just save them for the, you know, the big festivals or when you're in a crisis or something like that. Because again, it's a practice that you get better at, you know, and you don't want to do your first divination when you're facing some big question. Now, you may have beginner's luck, of course, but you may not. And so if you're used to some techniques and you know which techniques work well for you, which don't work so well, then you've got the tools available. Just like with magic, if you're doing some regular magical practice, you know what works for you and what doesn't work so well. And so then when you need it, you've got it. So I guess that would be my main recommendation is have a regular spiritual practice and evaluate it, you know, evaluate how it's working for you.
Absolutely. No, that is wonderful advice. I could not agree more. Absolutely. So for people who are looking to find out more about your works, I'm obviously going to put links to all, you know, your books in the show notes. So for people who are listening, you can just, you know, you'll be able to click below and find links. But where do people find you, or where are you published? Where are you writing? What should we know?
Okay, so I am on Facebook. I'm not a very active Facebook user, but if you look for John Opsopaus on Facebook, you'll find me there. I have a website, opsopaus.com, and that's where there's information on my books. There's supplementary information as well as information about the books themselves. There's also a link to my old Bibliotheca Arcana site that I started back in the 1990s. So there's all sorts of old writings there and stuff, including, you know, the original Alphabet Oracle website. But there's other information. So like if they look on the pages, I should say, devoted to the oracles of Apollo, they will also see some other charts and stuff like that associated with the Alphabet Oracle. So that's where I put most of my stuff is on the website. And they can get in touch with me there too, email me and I'll reply to them that way. So that's the best place probably. But you know, if you can do Facebook too, if that's
yes. It is still good for connecting people, even with all its problems. So that
yes,
is
exactly.
well, yeah. I cannot thank you enough for your writings. They are super helpful. I've really enjoyed them. My coven has really enjoyed them. I know so many of my friends enjoy your work. So thank you so much for this conversation, and I can't wait to talk to you about your next book.
Happy to do it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
inviting me.
Black moon above, stars overhead. Don't you dare guide me back to my bed. The river is frozen, the pollen pads bare. Don't wait for